Leadership Series 2006. This is our last presentation for the spring, and those of you that have attended every session, I think we promised a certificate. We should have a list, if you've signed in, a list of those who have done that. If we error, which happens occasionally, just email me or Marty Gunyon and we'll get that straightened away. We would like you to fill out the evaluations. We're interested in all aspects of the evaluation, but particularly what you might like to see for future series, particularly for next year, and we're going to start on that process pretty soon. Today's speaker is, I'm going to go ahead, Dr. Mary Kinnaman, who, since she's defended her PhD dissertation, I think it's kosher to do that. But actually, it's true. She's actually receiving her PhD tomorrow from the University of Missouri, Kansas City. So, yay. I'm sure it was a brutal PhD defense, right? They grilled you? Yes, okay. Actually, I've known Mary Kinnaman for a long time. I probably shouldn't say what year, but it was soon after I arrived here that she worked with Dr. Jim Thomas in surgery, doing basic research on transplant patients. And one of Dr. Thomas's colleagues was Dr. John Clancy, whose lab was right next to mine. And so when I talked to Mike Bly about a speaker who would talk about collaborative behaviors, he said, Mary Kinnaman. And I was going to ask then, I thought, Kinnaman, it's not Jones, but, and then when we emailed, we found out that we actually knew each other. Mary's had quite a varied career. She has a bachelor's in biology from Pittsburgh State, a bachelor's in nursing from the University of Kansas, and tomorrow she'll have a PhD in nursing from the University of Missouri, Kansas City. I promised her a short introduction, but she's done a lot of different things that relate to, I think, professionalism issues, to communication, to conflict management and negotiation, to change management and teamwork, project management, case development, and I'd say overall in leadership. She is currently the Assistant Dean for Community Affairs and Director of Nursing Continuing Education here at the KU School of Nursing. Her topic for today is collaborative behaviors in decision-making, the characteristics, and the concept. Dr. Kinnaman.
Thank you, Dr. Klein. And thanks to all of you who made time in your busy schedules to come and share today some of the things that I found in my studies that I think are applicable to you in your work. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to such a wide audience, a wide and varied audience about this important topic. Having just spent the last 7 years working on my PhD, it is really great to be at a point where I can begin to share some of those findings that I have learned through my readings, through working with my mentors, and through my own research with others, and in the hopes that it will benefit you. When I started my doctorate degree, I had to sort of declare an area of interest, and my area of interest was collaboration. And at that point in time, in 1998, there wasn't really a lot of interest in the topic, and many people sort of told me that was passé, that was an 80s thing, and I really ought to be thinking about something that was more timely. But it was really interesting in the 7 years that I was in the program how things began to change. As you know, the Institute of Medicine released a report talking about what the issues are that we face in the healthcare delivery system, and I think that sort of spurred a whole host of things that ended up with us much more interested in collaboration and decision-making. For me, life is really about decision-making, and for those of you who have children, you probably recognize, too, that one of your goals as a parent is to help children learn to make good decisions. When we get up in the morning, we make decisions. We've made decisions about when to set the alarm. We make decisions about what we're going to wear today. We make decisions about how we're going to get to work, and we make decisions about where to park when we get here. Oh, wait a minute, let's not go there. So really, decision making is universal. Regardless of what your role is here at the university, what your role is at home, you are continually making decisions. And as if you were like most of us, we're always interested in how can we make better decisions, because we want to use our time wisely and we want to be effective in the things that we do. I have been interested in organizational science for a long, long time. And I think part of it had to do with the large number of organizations that I have churned my way through in my number of years. I've never really decided what I want to be when I grow up. So I've taught high school biology. I've worked for pharmaceutical companies in drug development. I've worked for insurance companies, and I've worked in academic settings. So I've just done a little bit of everything. But regardless of where I was, what always fascinated me was how organizations used knowledge and made decisions about the work of the organization. And sometimes it left you shaking your head, wondering how in the world they made decisions. But it was a continual area of interest for me. So I really believe that the success of any organization is dependent on how well they use knowledge and make decisions in that day-to-day. And so one of those, for me, crucial leadership roles is helping individuals figure out how best to make decisions. So hopefully some of the ideas we talk about today will help you in your leadership roles, in your positions. Think about those decision-making strategies that you use day to day. Now, one of the things I'd like to warn you about is that before you leave today, I'm going to challenge you with some things. So I want you to pay very special attention to what we talk about so you can take that challenge forward. Because without that, not much changes in organizations. All right, these are our objectives today, which I think you have on your handouts. But we're going to cover some information that's related to these 4 objectives. My goal really is to sort of whet your appetite. But please know that we are just scratching the surface. There is so much that has been done in the last 10 years in organizational science that we could share with you, but we have very little time to do that. So we're just going to really hit some highlights. Also know that under Dr. Bly's leadership, we have an area of organizational science in the School of Nursing. So there's considerable expertise there as well as research interest. So if you're ever looking for someone to collaborate with or to talk about the issues that you're facing in your roles, please know that we're there. One of the things that's very important that I think from my own readings and study is that we need some clarification around collaborative behaviors. There are a number of behaviors out there, some that are collaborative and some that aren't collaborative, but all of them apply to decision making. There's a lot of confusion around the term collaboration, and if you've read many articles, and I have read lots of articles about collaboration, everyone uses the term differently. So that really makes it difficult to think about research or to think about the implications of collaboration if we're all sort of using a different standard by which to talk about collaboration. Ms. Gunyon informed me that there were a number of people attending the conference today that had indicated they were interested in topics on team building and working in groups. So I also want to spend a little time to talk about that area, to differentiate groups from teams, and to talk about collaboration within groups and teams. And then finally, I want to look at how leadership and management relate to collaborative decision making. And to talk a little bit about the theory that each of us use when we make decisions in our day-to-day life, and how that theory that we use can affect the decisions we make about collaboration or about other decision-making behaviors. So why, as I mentioned, there had been renewed interest in collaborative behaviors. Why do you think there is such interest? This was the picture that Mike used, Dr. Bly used in his first presentation, and I really think it does a nice job of really summing up why we've become so interested in decision making. And if I were to boil it down to one word, it's complexity. What we have created in the healthcare system, which is the system that you are finding yourself in, is very, very, very complex. And in fact, in some of the articles and so forth that I've read, the authors continually point out of all of the organizations that they've tried to study, the healthcare system presents the most complex organizations. So when you think about why it's complex, we know it's a huge business. It consumes nearly a fifth of our gross national product. We ration healthcare through financing and reimbursement processes that in themselves consume nearly as much as what we spend on drugs, which many people complain about, and even nursing home care. So the administration piece, because it's so complex, eats a lot of those dollars. We also spend a significantly larger amount on health care than any other country in the world. And that would be great if our outcomes were indicative of that expense, but they're not. Because when you actually look at our healthcare outcomes, they are not as good as many other countries that can spend considerably less. And in addition, we have 47 million people that are uninsured, so they lack access to appropriate health care. And there's many, many more that don't have enough coverage, so they aren't adequately covered. We have created role after role after role after role. Through the years, because of the increased specialization of healthcare, the increased technology, the increased use of drugs, we have created specialties and subspecialties and sub-subspecialties to deal with that complexity in healthcare. We have an aging population that has multiple chronic conditions, and trying to figure out how to manage these patients in that complex environment has become increasingly difficult. So again, more and more complexity. Imagine that poor patient who is he himself trying to manage that system, which he assumes is there to coordinate his care. And what usually he finds instead is that each little entity is an entity to their own, who has not connected with the other entities around them to provide any type of continuity of care. So he's also faced with those problems of receiving adequate care, and the result is really, really a problem, and something that through the Institute of Medicine we've actually begun to quantify. And some of the things that the Institute of Medicine, of course, has told us is that we need to provide patient-centered care. And as part of that patient-centered care, we need to provide a team-based environment, and we need to provide evidence-based care. What's fascinating, though, is that you look at those two initiatives, and as you understand and think about collaborative behaviors, you determine or decide that there's really different behaviors involved in those two things that they've told us to do. So we face a paradox. Some of the information that we know from the literature that is driving some of this increased concern about collaboration is that 70 to 80% of our healthcare errors are due to human factors that are associated with interpersonal interactions. What's interesting here is, you're probably saying, wow, that's a lot of errors. But as you really sort of study that, you still kind of come back with sort of the idea of, well, okay, but what do I fix? What do they mean? What are interpersonal interactions, and what do I do about that? Another sobering statistic is that we've spent a lot of money on total quality management and on re-engineering. We've hired very expensive consultants to come in to our organizations to help us think about how we do things better. A lot of time and energy is spent on quality initiatives, so we plan, do, check, and act to try to make changes in organizations. And then when we look at how did we do, about 3/4 of those initiatives fail. That's a problem when you think about the cost that was probably spent on those initiatives. We also know that past studies have indicated that about more than 60% of medication errors are, again, caused by interpersonal communication. So when you think about that, again, you should ask the question, well, what type of interpersonal communication? What communication do we need to be doing better to make better decisions about care? I want to tell a little story, and like Paul Harvey, I want to save the rest of the story till the end. Waterbury Hospital is a hospital in Connecticut that's about a 350-bed acute care hospital. Healthcare professionals there identified that one of the challenges they had was with medication management, which fit well with this problem. Now, they knew that this was a JCHO initiative, but actually it didn't come out of quality management. The problem didn't. And in fact, what happened was there was a small group of people who were interested in improvement and interested in doing something to improve things that got together and started talking. And as they talked, they said one of the problems that they faced was interpersonal communication. But the more they talked about that problem, the more they decided they didn't know where to begin or what to do with it. So as they talked, they said, well, you know, we also have a problem with this medication issue, that there's all these errors with people that have been discharged. And as they discussed it, they realized that, you know, a lot of times in trying to provide that continuum of care for patients, there were lots of errors from one setting to the other, from acute care to home, those types of issues. And the information was not getting relayed in the way that it should. And they ended up with patients who were ended up taking multiple medications because they didn't know they were supposed to discontinue a medication when they got home because they had used a different one in the hospital. So patients were taking double doses of antihypertensives and all these other things. So they knew that they had a huge problem, and they began to brainstorm what they'd like to do about that. So what they did was, I think, fairly novel. Now, when they began to look at this problem, what they identified that was in their little study was that only 13% of professionals used effective communication when they were discharging their patients, and that 49% of these discharged patients had a problem with their medication when they went home. Now, once they implemented their change, when they re-looked at that data, they found that 78%, it was 13, remember, 78% of professionals that they talked to were now using tools correctly to communicate discharge instructions about medications to patients. And they had they found that patients were 66% more likely to use their medications without problems. And that was just in a 6-month period in a very small pilot. So when we come back to it then, when we ask that question, why the renewed interest, we know what we really want to do is improve problem solving and decision making. One of the other interesting findings that sort of spurred my research had to do with nurses' decision making. So I'm going to share some of those findings today. One of the findings that we know is that decision making is consistently rated very low when you look at things that make nurses satisfied with their work environments. But the current tools that are being used to assess that tell us little about, again, what does that mean? What would make them happier? What's not working? So part of the implications of my study really deal with what nurses found would improve their work environment. Another thing that has happened very recently is there's a whole wave of initiatives that sort of play into these ideas about collaborative decision making. And one of those comes from the work of Gary Klein, who has looked at decision making. What we found is that most of the decision making research had been done in a really controlled environment. And out of that came what's called a decision making model and a decision event model, which was basically described as a process of pulling together all available information and then choosing from all those alternatives. Well, when Gary Klein started studying this in the early 1990s, he was interested more in what was happening in natural settings rather than in laboratory settings. And what he found was that he really couldn't substantiate the models that had been shown in laboratory settings. When he was studying folks like firefighters and nurses that worked in intensive care units, what he found was that in those high-stakes situations where there was lots of stress, there was no way that nurses went or the firefighters went through this decision-making process. And instead, what he demonstrated was that they used basically this type of a map to make their decisions. And from that, they basically very quickly pull that best possible approach that they can that fits in with all the patterns they know and are experienced with, and they implement that process because they don't have time for that other type of decision making. Now, this is very relative to healthcare, to our healthcare environment, because the types of decisions that most of our healthcare professionals are making are in an environment that's very much like what he was looking at. We have very ill-structured problems. The environments that we work in are very dynamic and change on an almost daily basis. There's shifting or ill-defined and competing goals. And there's action feedback loops that no matter what we do seems to impact something else that we didn't think about or want to impact. There's high stakes, there's multiple players, and there's organizational goals and norms that we're all working against. One of the interesting findings with nurses came from some work by Beth Crandall, who was a colleague of Klein's. In the old days, we as nurses used to talk about intuitive decision making, and we got poo-pooed. And we're basically told that we couldn't substantiate our intuition with decision making. But what Crandall actually found in her work with neonatal nurses was that in the preemies, experienced nurses who had been around a while and understood the reactions and the patterns that they expected to see with well newborns actually could recognize sepsis 24 hours before any clinical test demonstrated that the infant had sepsis. So these were some of the results that played into this idea that perhaps there is more to this decision making than we've given credit. If some of this fascinates you, there's a new book out by Malcolm Gladwell that wrote The Tipping Point called Blink, and he gives example after example of these types of decisions that we make every single day, these patterns of decisions. So to distinguish between collaborative and non-collaborative behaviors, then we're going to talk about the non-collaborative behaviors first. And those are toleration, coordination, and cooperation. Toleration is a type of decision making that's characterized by behaviors that we've sort of routinized. We just sort of do them without thinking. I mean, how many of you drive to work or drive home in the evening and you wonder, how did I get here? Because the decisions were just so routine, they've become ingrained in everything we do. They also, in an organization, sort of become the culture of, it's the way we've always done it here. So we don't give a lot of thought to what we're doing sometimes. One of the examples that's often used is that even though we recognize that the care for our patients needs to be on a 24/7 basis, there are many services that are not available on a 24/7 basis. And we just sort of work around and make do when those services aren't available until Monday at 8 in the morning so that we can schedule those services. Now, we do need to caution that although toleration can help us get some of our decisions made and work done, that it may not necessarily always mean that we're making the right decisions. One of the examples that from the literature that I liked was given by Ruth Anderson. She is an NIH-funded researcher from Duke who has been interested in looking at how decision-making in nursing home affects the outcomes of nursing home patients. And one of the things that she discovered was that when you have toleration present, people make decisions based on the knowledge that they have. And she noticed on interviewing nurse aides and nurses that were working in these nursing homes that there were instances when nurse aides would make decisions about the care of the patient that, had they maybe communicated with an RN, might have had different outcomes. In particular, the one that she talked about the most had to do with nurse aides when there wasn't good participative decision making in that home, had a patient who was acting out, who was, had behaviors that were problematic. Well, the nurse aide's frame of reference, because they didn't have the amount of knowledge that the RN did, was that, this child is acting like my child does when they're misbehaving. So from their frame of reference, what they needed to do was to place that person in timeout, which is what they did. In those situations where a nurse was involved, however, a nurse would reassess that patient and make a determination, are we looking at a depressed patient? Are there other factors that are going on that are causing this behavior that we need to intervene with? So it made a huge difference in the outcomes of the patient. Coordination is another decision-making behavior that is extremely important. And it's important in a lot of the things we do, and it's important in healthcare. When physicians write orders and nurses carry the orders out, this is an example of coordination. The use of evidence-based practice, care paths, the use of electronic records where we can communicate back and forth with each other are, again, ways that we can improve coordination. In my research, the nurses told lots and lots of stories about coordination, and they viewed it very positively because improvements in coordination enabled them to be more effective and efficient in getting those 5 patients taken care of on their shift and getting all of those things done that needed to happen for that patient. Now, what this requires is that individuals be responsible for their behavior to make coordination work. And when that doesn't happen, what the nurses in my study did was express dissatisfaction, seeing that as barriers to them providing effective care to patient. So if they can't read the notes, for example, that was perceived as a barrier to their decision making. Delegation is another type of decision making that we see lots more of by nurses because we have more aides on the floor because we have fewer nurses available. And the nurses in my study were extremely satisfied with their aides to assist them with that coordination of care. Finally, as we move to cooperation, cooperation is a level where we now start to have actual interaction, face-to-face discussion type interactions, where we're looking at working together for mutual benefit, in this instance for the patients. We have shared objectives, but the one thing that we do have is that people still maintain their professional identities. So there's roles and expectations of the physician, there's roles and expectations of the nurse. So in the discussion that we talked about before, where the physician writes an order and the nurse carries it out, one of the things the nurses also talked a lot about on this particular floor was their responsibility in their professional identity to assess the patient and to be continually identifying when there might be a time when you didn't want to administer a medication. Maybe their blood pressure was high. Should I give that antihypertensive? And then calling that physician with the necessary information that he needs to make a decision about, do I need to change that order or what do I need to do? So again, cooperation is a good decision-making behavior that the nurses identified as very appropriate and needed. Finally, the collaborative behavior which we came to talk to today basically is collaboration. As we talk about collaboration, we have tried to more clearly define collaboration than what you'll sometimes see as the definition of collaboration in the literature. Collaboration we see as is a process that fosters innovation and advanced problem solving. It's among people who are of different disciplines, organizational ranks, institutional settings, and potentially of different experiential level. They band together for advanced problem solving, and they discern innovative solutions without regard to discipline rank or institutional affiliation. So what we're looking at here is a balanced table where people can truly work together to come out with the best solutions. So they've suspended professional identities to get there. And then they enact change based on that higher standard of care that they're trying to achieve. Began, Zimmerman, and Dewey provided a great example of collaboration in an article they wrote in 1997. At that time, AIDS was considered to be an intractable problem in developing countries. And that assumption was based on that decision was based on 5 basic assumptions. The first one was that the impact of today's interventions and prevention efforts are going to take a couple of generations to play out. The second was that the cost of the antiretroviral drugs was really out of reach for the poor countries. So, how could they possibly overcome this? Third was the treatment was a luxury in poor countries, and most countries can't afford. So usually they choose one or the other, and most opt to go to look at prevention and see how they can manage it. And then next was that we have a lot of uneducated and illiterate patients who can't manage these complicated drug regimens. And then finally, meaningful solutions require sophisticated, integrated national health care systems. These were the assumptions that they were working from as the World Health Organization talked about how they were going to start to manage AIDS. Now, while the World Bank in 1992 said that estimated, based on these assumptions, that Brazil would have 1.2 million cases of AIDS by the year 2000, they in fact only had 500,000 cases. So what Brazilians really did was they really took those challenges and they didn't take those assumptions as limiting their ability to make change. Instead, what they did was they collaborated and talked about how they could get there, how they could achieve control of this awful disease. So rather, they asked about how the cost of drugs, for example, could be reduced and so that everybody could get treatment, rather than just assuming that, well, they couldn't provide treatments because the drugs were too high. They asked how they could achieve their prevention goals while treating those that were infected, rather than just taking the one or the other approach. To address the first question, what the Brazilian government did was they produced a generic alternative of the antiretroviral drugs. And they did this by exploiting a World Trade Organization clause that it was in support of violating patent laws in cases of national emergency. And they viewed this as a national emergency. And then they provided those drugs free of charge. To address the second question in treatment about the prevention, they decided they were going to do both at the same time. And even though the healthcare system of Brazil was extremely fragmented, they were able to basically align the resources that were needed to create the partnerships that were necessary and basically overcome all of those assumptions that had been made about their ability to control this awful disease. And by the time they completed, they were actually at a level with San Diego in the control of their drug, in the control of AIDS. Now, among the strategies that, as the number of healthcare errors has risen, there's also been an increased interest in the development of care delivery processes that minimize potential for error. And one of those things that we continue to see in the literature is the implementation of interdisciplinary teams. So this sort of brings us around to that second objective, which is to explore the relationship between the functions of teams and groups as decision-making entities. Katzenbach and Smith have a book that was written in '93, which many of you may have read, and they also wrote an article that was published in HBR on teams. And what they really did was to study and look at and decide what it was that made teams effective, so they could help people figure out, do you need a team, and if you need a team, what needs to be in place to make that team effective. So their definition of team was that it's a small group of people with complementary skills who are committed to a common purpose, set of performance goals, and an approach for which they hold themselves mutually accountable. There are a number of team values that underlie teams, successful teams. There are things like listening and responding constructively to the views of others on the teams, giving others the benefit of the doubt, so that trusting relationship, providing necessary support, and recognizing the achievement of others. Understanding how teams deliver extra performance, it's really important to differentiate between groups and teams. And some of these things are the things that we talked about when we talked about the decision-making behaviors. In working groups, you'll see a strong, clearly focused leader. In teams, you're going to see a shared leadership role. Because remember when we talked about collaboration, we talked about having that equal playing field. that there's not necessarily the hierarchy that you see in organizations. In working groups, you usually hold individuals accountable for the work to be done, but in teams, what you're really interested in is the products that the teams produce. So in groups, you have individual work products. On teams, you have collective work products. Working groups are, they do things like run efficient meetings. In teams, efficiency is not as important as having the open-ended discussion and active problem-solving meetings. Working groups also measure their effectiveness by how well they influence others, so they look at things like financial performance, where the teams actually look more at those work products. Have we improved the outcomes, for example? So working groups basically discuss, decide, and delegate, and teams discuss, decide, and they actually do the work together. Teams add value through the people that are on those teams. And some of the things that come out of good teams are that you have improved morale. People have more fun when they have a team that's working well. They've also found that teams are more productive, that communication is improved, conflict resolution is improved, problem solving is improved, learning is improved, discipline. They talk about discipline because individuals know their role, they hold each other responsible is improved. And they also are able to speed up changes in organizations, because one of the things we know is that we can make decisions and 12 years later we might make a bit of a change. So teams can speed that. So teams have the advantage of helping organizations learn faster and adapt quicker through those people. Now, with teams also come some issues, and probably all of you that are sitting there are fully aware of those issues. There's much resistance. There's many times in organizations a lot of resistance to teams. Teams are challenged to implement an organization, in complex organizations like healthcare organizations, it's daunting just to think about who should be on the team. So if what you're trying to put together is a small team and you've got individuals that maybe should be on that team who are working 12-hour shifts and are there 2 days a week, you have a daunting challenge before you to think about who needs to be on that team. There's also a real lack of conviction about the effectiveness of teams, and most of you have probably worked on something called a team and felt it was a dismal failure, that it didn't initiate change, that ended up being huge griping sessions and nothing really got done. So that sort of sets up a history that makes people fairly resistant to teams. The other thing that's important is that you have to really have an organizational environment in place that really supports the risk-taking that's involved in putting teams together. Because there's real discomfort that's involved in making significant organizational cultural changes, and you're not always going to make perfect change, so there has to be sort of this risk-taking environment that's present. And the other thing is that if organizations have had a real long history of not holding people individually accountable, it's real difficult to get to group accountability if you've not been there. The other thing about teams is that sometimes they're sort of put in place more as a process to gain more control, and that because of the organizational environment you sort of end up with the yes team, and the people are just there to sort of let administration or whoever that's seen as the leader on the team make those decisions. So these end up wasting time and money, they defer decisions, they provide the wrong information, they promote too many compromises, and you end up with just greater stagnation in the organization. So to build effective teams, what Katzenbach says is that there's a number of things that we need. So this should point out to you that this is not an easy job, because the basics of having an effective team involve that we have individuals with the appropriate skills, and that includes problem solving, technical and interpersonal skills. We've already identified that interpersonal skills are a real problem and contributing to the errors we have. So we first have to create a bunch of individuals that have these skills. Then we have to hold them accountable as individuals and as teams, and then we have to give them common goals and make sure that there's a common approach, that there's a meaningful purpose to what they do. And so all of these things are important. And then I would add that the other thing that's so critical is that you have an organizational environment that supports all of this, which I've talked about before. In my study, one of the things that I found with the particular organization I was looking at was that they did have the organizational environment that was supportive of good nurse decision-making for direct and indirect care. Although they weren't considered a magnet hospital, which is a status that hospitals that try to achieve where there is shared decision-making, they had lots of shared decision-making processes in place. Their mission statement, the values that were written, and how they made this happen was through 10 interdisciplinary teams. And through those teams, those nurses were charged with making decisions about how care should be provided in that institution. And out of that, you really came some great decision-making, a strong professional identity with what we're here to do, what we can do, and how we can get it done. So that environment is important. The other thing that's important about team development, about teams, are that they go through stages. And if you are the leader trying to put a team together, you are going to be in pain when you try to put a team together and make it work. But if you know up front that the teams go through these stages, you can sort of anticipate and be prepared for and work through some of those stages that the team will face. Now, this looks like it's a linear process. It's really not. Because every time you change a member on a team or you give them a new challenge, they may have to go back up to another stage and work through it before they get to that point where they actually perform. But at every stage of this team, there are questions to be answered about who we are, why we're here. In the storming, it's things like, well, who said this was a good idea and why do we need to change? And then as we begin to norm, it's things about, well, how do we work together more effectively? So there's lots of questions to be answered. Another way of looking at the difference between work groups and teams is to look at where your employees are. We know we talked about that individual accountability. Well, you need very experienced people to be on team who know what their role on that team is and to be able to effectively perform that team. Well, employees go through stages of growth too. And the way that management and leadership usually works is that we perform different roles with those people depending on where they are in their own professional development. So if they're fairly new and they don't really know their role, we're about trying to provide that person the appropriate direction, telling them what it is that they need to do and providing that support. In a work group, there's been more, they are still independent, but there's some influence, so we sort of think about them being at the adolescent stage. So until individuals are really, really experienced, they're really not able to be fully functional in a team as that collaborative entity. So all of these things influence whether or not you choose a work group or a team. When teams actually get to the top, or when they get to that level we call performing, it is a beautiful thing. And what they say is that these teams have synergy. And you can see this long list of things that Katzenbach and Smith identified as present when you have a fully functioning team. Now, the other side of that story is very few teams get there, for all of the reasons that we've talked about today. So you don't undertake creating teams lightly. I thought this saying was sort of interesting in the fact that it actually was made many, many years ago by Abraham Lincoln. Because when you look at today, you'd have to say, well, not much has changed, has it? We're still facing some incredible things that we need to overcome if we're going to be effective in the organizations that we work in. And some of that is going to come through leadership and collaboration. So understanding when do we use collaboration, how can we use it to be effective, is going to be very important. And how can we promote it when it's needed? So I have for you some premises. One of those premises comes from Albert Einstein, who's a favorite of mine. And what he said is sort of reminds me of the serenity prayer, you know. It's about really understanding and knowing when things are simple and when they're not. And not trying to choose those simple solutions when in fact what we need is a solution to address a much more complex underlying problem. Many times what we treat is the symptom and not the problem. And having that wisdom to know the difference is what leadership is about. In my study with nurses, I asked them about the decisions that they made that were routine. And what they described for me was a very linear process of making decisions. They talked about the model that they used to manage information, to organize that information so that they could provide care in a timely manner. So it's important. They felt this was very important to their work. Each of them had sort of a unique process for doing it. But leaders need to know and understand that we need to provide supports for linear decision making, because this is what sort of keeps down our level of stress and makes us more effective in our roles. And when we're more effective in our roles, we're going to feel better about the work we do and the things that we get done. So knowing when that solution is linear and what needs to be in place is very important. Now, when they talked about linear decision making, they were talking about the use of behaviors that were non-collaborative. And in the main, they were talking about their ability to use toleration, to get the work done without having to involve a lot of other people, or coordination, where they could very quickly make those decisions without a lot of face-to-face interpersonal interactions. However, when I talked to them about decisions they would consider complex, the stories they told me were much more nonlinear in nature. And what they talked about was the fact that as issues got complicated, as there were problems that arose, where they had maybe two patients that were sort of going bad, or something was changing with the patient but they weren't sure what and they needed to get some support, they began to talk about all of these ways that they began to manage those resources and make decisions about what they needed to do. They talked a lot about collaboration. They defined collaboration as involving the individuals on that unit. So this was a little beyond the scope of what we had defined collaboration going into the research project as, because they collaborated with the nurses on the unit, which they did not do. They didn't really work with the nurses so much on the unit when they were in that linear mode. But once we got into a mode where things became complicated and complex, they pulled them in to say, have you ever seen this before? What are your suggestions? What do we need to be doing? So these types of things that were going on were about cooperation and collaboration. Now, one of the things that they did not ever share with me was a collaborative event with a physician. By the time it got to the attending physician, they went into their professional roles. The information that was shared was very much in terms of cooperating to get these things done. So, one of the things that I want to talk about now is really what keeps us from using these decision-making strategies appropriately. And one of the things that has come out of the literature is some work by Begun. And what he says is that there's this major source of inertia in really complex organizations, and it's due to the dominant logic that's present in the organization. And that dominant logic sort of creates a screen about what we think is possible to do in the organization. So according to him, we have data that's flowing into the system, but what that organization does with that data is how that organization learns. So we see that reflected in the structures that are in place, the values of the organizations, the performance measures that are used, and about those behaviors that are reinforced in the system. You know, how successful are you at initiating collaborative behaviors with others? Do others make the time for those types of interactions? In stable environments, I forgot that was on. One of the things I wanted to say was that my premise really is that it's not we believe what we see, it's we see what we believe. We see what we believe based on that dominant logic. So in stable environments, dominant logic is a really good thing because it enables us to make very quick decisions about what we need to do. But what we've talked about today is how complex our environments have become. So we can only use that decision making in a situation when things are stable, not so much when they aren't. So you might ask, well, how did we get here? Why is it that we use so much of this decision-making that's very linear in nature and that we think this is what we need to use? And what I would say is that probably the success of linear decision-making was probably started by an individual by the name of Frederick Winslow Taylor, who came up with scientific principles of management and who, in industrial settings, determined that there is always one best way to do things. And most of us have lived in organizations where we believe that that's true. And it's only as complexity has increased that we've begun to understand that there isn't always one best way. That way that we do things is really dependent on the organization that we work in, who's involved in the decision, how complex the situation, how many possible ways that you can solve the problem. In other words, how nonlinear situations might be. Premise number 3 then is insanity is doing the same thing over and over, expecting different results, which is another one of my favorite quotes that's been attributed to Einstein. Some of the figures that I provided you at the first of the discussion should help you understand that we continue to do things over and over and get the same results. And until we begin to think about how we use nonlinear decision making to solve some of these complex problems that we have, we're going to continue on that route of insanity. We know that there's many factors that impact our decision making, and because of that we have to again look at how can we begin to make decisions more effectively. The last premise is that, and this is where the paradox comes in, is that status-driven hierarchical processes that most of us live and work in really undermine analysis and problem solving because they come from the linear model, that you always have to go up to get your solutions to your problems. Now, paradoxically, these processes work when we're talking about toleration and coordination. They don't work as well when we talk about needing cooperation and collaboration. So Brenda Zimmerman suggests that there's really 3 leadership trends that we need to look at. Leading healthcare organizations is going to require a lot of tolerance for ambiguity on our parts, and most of us have not been trained to deal with ambiguity. We're going to need an appetite for novelty, which means we're going to have to be able to take risk, and a capacity to act even in the face of uncertainty. Leaders are going to need to look outside healthcare for solutions that work and try to figure out how to adapt those solutions to our healthcare organizations. And number 3, relationships are everything because we get our work done through our relationships with others in these complex nonlinear situations. So coming back to the rest of the story, how did Waterbury make such dramatic improvements? Well, what they did is use collaborative decision making. They had this group of people that were together, decided that the way they would approach this problem was they'd do a pilot study. And they got volunteers who were interested in the problem to make calls to the patients that did a good job of managing their medication. Wow. And they listened to their stories. Tell us how you manage your medication. What works for you? Here you have 6 chronic diseases and you're on 25 medications. How do you make it work? So those patients described for them how that worked. Everyone came back together, shared those stories, and from those stories they came up with a very simple solution to a problem that enabled them to get those fantastic results in 20 minutes. That solution was this. Talk about something small making a big effect. They now give every single patient one of these cards, and they fill it out that has all of their medications on it, and those patients can put it in their pocket, carry it wherever they go, and they make sure they have one of those when they're discharged, so it's real clear. So pretty neat ways of looking at nonlinear and what impact it can have on our lives. I'm going to bring you back to one of the slides again that Dr. Bly used in his first presentation. Really, the most critical aspect of leadership really is that ability to use relationships for some constructive good. And when we talk about decision-making strategies and what works, those relationships of collaborative decision-making, cooperative decision-making, are all about how good those relationships are. Some of the readings that I would suggest to you, if you're interested in some of these topics, are found on this page. The challenges I would like to leave you with. My first challenge is that you are able to now critically evaluate the decision-making strategies as one of the ones that we talked about today. And again, this is important because they're so misused in the literature. And if we are going to use them effectively, we must understand what constitutes them. My second challenge to you is sort of summed up by an old saying in Texas that was often repeated by a perinatologist, Joan Richardson, that I worked with at the University of Texas Medical Branch. And she said, when you find yourself riding a dead horse, it's best to dismount. We're on a dead horse. So my challenge is to you to think about the situations in your own roles, wherever you are and whatever you do, and ask yourself, are you using decision-making strategies that are limiting your ability to be effective? So if you're only using those linear decisions, can you use some nonlinear decisions, and how would you do that? And then finally, last week we attended a session, and I've already forgotten where the speaker said, when you find yourself in a hole, it's a good idea to stop digging. So one of the other things that we would like to leave you with is Dr. Bly, again, I had mentioned, has an expertise and interest, as do I, in organizational science. And in fact, we're strange, we love it. So if you need someone to bounce some ideas off about how you can improve organizational effectiveness through problem-solving, decision-making, we're here. We'd like to help. We'd like to have some nonlinear conversations and talk with you about some research ideas or whatever that might help you going forward. And with that, it's Cinco de Mayo, so I should be saying gracias.